Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service through a unique partnership with Alaska Public Media. It is Wednesday, December 28th, 2022. And if you'd like additional weather information on top of what I provide, you can go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's online presence, and it'll bring you to a map of the continental U.S. with Alaska and Hawaii to the lower left. And all you have to do is take your mouse, point, and click on it, and it'll allow you to pull up weather information, forecasts, and any relevant watches, warnings, or advisories for anywhere in the country. And looking at the map this Wednesday afternoon of most noteworthiness, we got a couple things going on. There's going to be a system come up through the Central Plains that's going to bring in much warmer air across the southern Great Lakes, Ohio, Tennessee valleys, all the way into the Northeast as we go through the rest of this week and especially early next week. Meanwhile, to the west, there is going to be a series of powerful Pacific storms coming on shore, especially impacting areas like California. As of now, there is a flood watch for the Sacramento Valley, and California is going to get blasted by a number of rounds of heavier precipitation, rain in the valleys, and heavier snows in the mountains. So that'll be in the news, I'm sure, coming up here in the days ahead. Meanwhile, in our state, Alaska, blowing snow and wind chills as cold as 55 below zero will continue overnight along the northwestern Arctic coast, especially places like Point Lay on up to Wainwright. Overall, though, a less active pattern the rest of this week. Temperatures are continuing to slowly moderate a bit compared to the cold that we were in here for a good portion of the month of December. There will be a weekend storm force front that pushes up across the Panhandle into the northern Gulf Coast, and that will bring snow changing to rain in all but the far northern Panhandle, along with some gale and storm force winds along the Panhandle and northern Gulf Coast. And overall, we're going to see milder air creep northward up into south central areas that could eventually lead to the potential for some freezing rain later on this holiday weekend, early next week, as that warmer air tries to push further north in areas surrounding Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound. Well, looking at the FAA webcams from across the state this afternoon, Point Lay blowing snow, air temperature 20 below zero around 2 o'clock this afternoon with a wind chill approaching 50 below zero. And that'll be the case here overnight, those conditions continuing into the day on Thursday. Further west, Wales there at the Bering Strait, mostly cloudy, temperature sitting at zero. You can see the helicopter there sitting out on the landing pad. And then further south, Dutch Harbor, still getting some light rain showers, but not the heavy rains that they saw last week prior to Christmas. The rain with this particular system should amount to less than an inch, and relatively mild temperatures, 43 degrees there this afternoon. Finally, in the southeast Panhandle, there has been some clearing. Breaks in the cloud cover has led to some areas of fog, especially around Petersburg. Further west, Angoon has seen some sunshine, broken cloud cover, temperature at 34 today. So the only notable advisory to report is the winter weather advisory for blowing snow and wind chills of 45 to 55 below zero. That'll continue tonight, at least in through the early afternoon there along the northwestern Arctic coast from Point Hope on up to Wainwright. And looking at the satellite imagery, we can see the pattern, the curl in the clouds. Areas of low pressure extend from south of the Gulf into the North Pacific, extending west-northwestward through Sandpoint to between Unalaska, St. Paul, and then back to just south-southwest of Adak. And this feature is going to drift a little further north over the next couple of days. And we don't anticipate things to be, this pattern is not nearly as strong, the weather systems are not nearly as strong nor as moist as the ones that affected the state last week prior to Christmas. So looking at the weather maps, we have a few areas of low pressure there sitting south of the Alaska Peninsula, just north of the eastern Aleutians, and then south of the central Aleutians, with frontal boundary extending along the lower Gulf North Pacific interface. There is a weak area of high pressure up there in northwestern Canada, around just over 1,000 millibars. If you recall, last week we had a really strong Arctic high that was up around 1060 millibars. And then you'll notice up along the west coast, the Seward Peninsula, lower Chukchi Sea coast, there's a trough, and there are some stronger winds associated with that feature. Overnight, early on Thursday morning, just look at the parade of low pressures that just kind of sitting there from the lower Gulf, extending westward back toward the eastern and central Aleutians. And we expect that to lift a little further north as we go through this week. The next system, there'll be a little system that brings some precipitation up into the Panhandle on Thursday, but the main weather system, the next stronger storm force front, will not be arriving and pushing across the Panhandle on up into the northern Gulf Coast until later this weekend on Sunday, just in time for New Year's Day. So stay tuned to later forecast regarding that system. And by Friday, we're just kind of in that interim period waiting for that to happen, and continue to have that string of low pressures from the northeastern Gulf, North Pacific, all the way back toward areas south of the central Aleutians. So temperature-wise, Thursday morning, lows will stay above freezing outer and southern Panhandle coast, but below freezing inner channels, especially Petersburg, Wrangell, northward on up through Skagway. And we're going to still see some sub-zero lows in the Copper River Basin, Glen Ellen, and on the other side of the Alaska Range at McGrath. Daytime highs Thursday will be back up around 40, Sitka, Craig, as well as on the other side of the Gulf there at Kodiak. And then for Friday morning, lows will still be below freezing in the northern and eastern side of the inner channels there of the Panhandle. Still about 12 below or so there, Copper River Basin and toward McGrath. Above freezing temperatures also from Kodiak Island down along the Alaska Peninsula. And then Friday afternoon highs, we should get readings back up above freezing in most areas of the Panhandle, except the far north around Skagway on up toward White Pass. And temperatures continue to moderate a bit, may actually be a little warmer than that in Anchorage, maybe even mid-upper 20s for highs come Friday afternoon. Coldest temperatures reside in the far north along the North Slope Arctic coast. Some areas will be down around 20 or so below, especially there like Point Lay. And then daytime highs, single digits, generally above, but still a bit below zero at Arctic Village and Fort Yukon, and then below zero along the Arctic coast North Slope. Friday morning lows, not quite as cold there along the Arctic coast, but still in that 10 to near 20 below range. And we could see some 10 and 20 below readings there across the central eastern interior, especially with any partly cloudy skies. Friday afternoon, we're looking for highs generally single digits above or below zero across the central eastern and interior, as well as the North Slope and Arctic coast. 14 or so as you get out toward Nome and areas south toward Eamonnok. And then for Thursday morning, lows will be near zero or below zero as you creep up the middle Yukon Valley, upper Kuskokwim Basin. And temperatures generally above freezing along the Alaska Peninsula, extending out into the Aleutian chain. Thursday afternoon highs will reach lower 40s from Dutch Harbor on up to Kodiak, but remain only in the lower teens as you get up further north of Anvik and head up toward, say, Galena there along the Yukon River. And then Friday morning lows, still some sub-zero readings, the upper Kuskokwim Basin, single digits, places like Bethel and Anvik. And then as we go down along the Alaska Peninsula, we expect readings to stay above freezing. Friday afternoon highs will likely still be near 40 at Kodiak as you head southwestward toward Chiknik and Dutch Harbor. So looking at the extended temperature forecast here, and this is for January 3rd through the 7th, the early New Year. Temperatures are expected to average above normal, initially centered around Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound. That will shift a little bit eastward after the new year, but we are not anticipating any unusually cold temperatures anywhere in the state. And with this influx of somewhat warmer air with south-southwest flow off the Gulf, that sets up a more favorable situation for some areas of south central to get into some freezing rain, because we have that warmer air aloft coming in over some colder remaining air near the surface. And if we check out the precipitation outlook, near normal precipitation anticipated across much of the state, but there is a potential for precipitation to average a little above normal, especially south of the Alaska Range, encompassing areas around Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, up through the Mat-Su valleys. So we'll keep an eye on those areas, because with any upslope flow of warmer air, that could lead to some areas of light freezing rain and light freezing drizzle here for the early new year. Otherwise, the pattern it will become a little more active, I think, here as we get toward and just past the new year, especially in southern parts of the state.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Let's take a look now at your aviation weather if you have a flight planned either Thursday or Friday. Overall, we continue to see a pattern whereby low pressure is located in through the Gulf and lower Gulf North Pacific interface, extending back out to the central eastern Aleutians. A weaker area of high pressure sitting up over northwest Canada, and a weak trough along the west-northwest side of the state. There will be areas of IFR on the south side of the Brooks Range associated with that northern trough. Other areas of IFR, western arm of the Alaska Range down across the Chugach Mountains, east side of the Kenai Peninsula surrounding Prince William Sound, and then back out toward the eastern and central Aleutians. For Thursday afternoon, areas of IFR continue across parts of the Arctic coast near and east of AKwx, as well as down along the lower Chukchi Sea coast. A broad area of IFR conditions will extend from the southern panhandle Thursday afternoon across the central Gulf to the east side of the Kenai, Kodiak Island, and covering a good portion of the Alaska Peninsula. For Friday morning, broad area of IFR conditions along the Brooks Range north slope into the northeast interior to the Alcan border. Pockets of IFR, central Alaska Range, and also down around Yakutat in through the northwestern Gulf, Kodiak Island, as well as the southwest coast from Kuskokwim Bay to Nunavik Island and St. Paul. Friday afternoon, we'll see a band of IFR conditions from Utqiagvik extending down in through the western central Brooks Range across the central Seward Peninsula, all the way southwestward down across St. Lawrence, St. Matthew, and down into the central Aleutians, while an area of IFR continues along the southwest coast, Bristol Bay, upper end of the Alaska Peninsula, and along the northern portion of the Gulf into the far northern panhandle. Anatuvik Pass will see IFR conditions Thursday morning give way to VFR. Adigan Pass, the same thing, IFR early, giving way to VFR. Further south and west along the west arm of the Alaska Range, IFR to start the day, Lake Clark and Merrill giving way to MVFR conditions. Same thing for Rainy Pass, IFR to MVFR. Windy Pass will start out with IFR conditions early, trying to give way to VFR conditions. And generally, further east you go, Isabel Pass should see VFR conditions, as will Mentasta Pass during the day on Thursday. Further south and west of there, Tanita Pass should generally remain VFR. And for Portage Pass, look for IFR conditions there southward in the morning, giving way, though, to MVFR conditions by Thursday afternoon. And finally, the far north end of the Panhandle, Chilkoot and White should see VFR conditions throughout the day Thursday. Freezing levels, the surface freezing line runs across the northern part of the Alaska Peninsula. The inside of Kodiak Island, the outer east side of the Kenai Peninsula, and then along the northern Gulf Coast in through the inner channels of the Panhandle, with freezing levels aloft bumping upward of 2,000 to 4,000 feet through the lower Gulf North Pacific interface. There is the potential for some icing along these trough frontal boundary lines, weak areas of low pressure, mainly from the southwestern part of the Panhandle, Haida Gwaii, westward through the central Gulf, along areas of the eastern Kenai Kodiak Island cutting across the Alaska Peninsula, generally above 4,000 feet, with above 6,000 feet there toward the lower Gulf and North Pacific. Jet stream level winds, nothing too impressive. The strongest upper level jet stream winds at 30,000 feet are south of this map across areas of the North and Northeast Pacific, bringing it down to 700 millibars. 9,000 feet, a weak high-pressure circulation located western Alaska range with weak low-pressure across areas of the Gulf centered southeast of Kodiak Island and between the central eastern Aleutians. And then at 3,000 feet, we see a couple of weak lows in the lower Gulf, and then also a couple of lows located near the central and just south of the eastern Aleutians, with some stronger wind flow coming in through the entrance of Cook Inlet and also on the backside there to the west of St. Paul. We expect the strongest turbulence to be just off the southwest coast of the Panhandle, as well as there around the entrance of Cook Inlet, Kodiak Island, to areas of the northern Alaska Peninsula. From the surface to 4,000 feet, there could be some isolated severe turbulence on the north side of these lows and frontal systems, and then a broad band of considerable moderate turbulence along the Gulf Coast, southwest part of the state, extending in through the eastern Aleutians.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, joined once again by the science liaison of GINA, Eric Stevens. GINA, of course, is the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And GINA is all about satellites, and Eric is always here to tell some really cool stuff about satellites. Now, the last time you were here, we talked about how the weather satellites can see clouds and what's under the clouds, but you're telling me that satellites can do a lot more, even protect the general public with aviation safety information.
That's right. There's one particular aspect of satellites we're going to talk about today that might not be immediately obvious, and that is detecting things in the atmosphere that are not clouds, that are not snow, not rain, but rather a hazard that can happen here in Alaska, and that is volcanic ash.
Of course.
When a volcano goes off, puts ash in the air, this is, of course, a hazard to the public if the ash were to fall on the ground in accumulating amounts.
Sure.
Additionally, while the ash is in the air, and this is the more frequent hazard, is it's a hazard to aviation, because you cannot fly an airplane into volcanic ash without great risk. Worst case scenario, the ash gets into a jet engine, it wrecks the engine, kills the engine, and now you have an airplane flying with no engines. It won't fly for long. So aviators need to avoid that ash. How do you avoid the ash? You have to know where it is by identifying it with a satellite image and perhaps predicting then where the ash will flow with the overall weather patterns. Satellites are so important for identifying when a volcano goes off and then tracking the ash after the volcano injects the ash into the atmosphere.
Now, are you talking about seeing the heat signature or a huge volcanic plume with a cloud that we're used to seeing in the really pretty pictures of any Alaska volcano that's erupted recently, readout, for example? Or are we talking about the really fine details? Because this is polar orbiting satellites, the ones that are very low to the ground, right?
The geostationary satellites can do some detection. The polar orbiters, like you say, they're closer to the Earth. They give the even better view. In answer to your question, I would say all of the above.
Oh, okay.
A heat signature from a volcano going off with all the heat that comes with the eruption, that can be identified in infrared imagery.
Okay.
We've got images from the Kamchatka Peninsula. That's the far eastern part of Russia on the western side of the Bering Sea, loaded with volcanoes.
Right.
You know, Alaska has plenty of volcanoes of its own. We can also be affected when a volcano goes off in Kamchatka, say, and then the weather carries that ash toward Alaska from the west.
Right.
You can see the infrared heat signature, like you say. Also, the ash in the air can be detected by doing some sophisticated channel differencing within the satellite data. You can find the identification of sulfur dioxide, say, that's a component of the volcanic emission, and you can trace this with the satellite imagery. Sometimes volcanoes go off that haven't gone off before, and we're not expecting them to go off. Say if there's no seismometers around a given volcano that hasn't gone off in 100 years, you might not be expecting it to go off. In the satellite imagery, since satellites can be globally comprehensive, that might be the first sign that you have that a volcano in an unexpected area is going off.
That's a good backup system. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
Right. And people are working all the time on automating the interrogation of satellite data by computers to provide a first alert to a human. So the software will say, we think this might be important. Human, go take a closer look. Because the people are still the best way to interrogate the imagery, but the planet's a big place, and we can't be looking everywhere all the time. So the software helps give a first cut. And then in Alaska, there's a special kind of surprise angle where the satellites are helpful, and that is the Katmai eruption of 1912. Huge eruption. There is still somewhat of a moonscape out there in southwest Alaska where all this ash is laying on the ground. And sometimes a strong weather pattern comes along where we have roaring northwest winds that go across the Alaska Peninsula there and can actually pick some of this ash up off the ground. No volcano is going off. This was more than 100 years ago that volcano actually blew. So you're not going to see a heat signature like we were discussing. There will be no seismic signature of a volcano going off. So those data sets, they'll say, oh, no problem. But you can see in some of the satellite imagery this ash, as it's called, resuspended. When the wind comes along, picks it up, the ash can be lofted a few thousand feet in the air just with the wind. And an airplane flying into that plume is exposed to some danger. So we need to track that ash to provide guidance to aviators that you don't want to be flying here at these elevations in this area. We've got some imagery of the resuspension, and you can see the wind blowing strongly from the northwest, picking up the ash and blowing it down to the southeast. And so that's another, perhaps not immediately obvious hazard of volcanic ash. Katmai is the gift that keeps on giving, for sure.
Very good. So we've got satellites that can help us understand the weather from the past and the immediate past, and we talked last time about how that's feeding into the forecast modeling to help improve predictions, but now they're also protecting the general public with aviation sensitive information and watching volcanoes, whether they're erupting or maybe have erupted in the past, and finding the left behinds from those volcanic events there. So really impressive stuff. Eric, thanks so much for joining us again today, and you're a gift that keeps on giving from the satellite community, so thanks a lot, and we hope to have you back again soon. Again, Eric Stevens with Gina at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And if you'd like to check out any of the information that Eric has shared with us again today, you can do that very easily by going to www.gina.alaska.edu. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Time to wrap up today's show, starting with the sea ice edge. We have extensive ice across the far north, Beaufort Sea, Chukchi Sea, down through the Bering Strait and in through Norton Sound. Of note, especially around St. Lawrence Island, we are anticipating, with the continued north-northeast flow here through the weekend, that the ice, some of the computer forecast models for the ice is to push it further south and west by another 50 to 70 miles by early next week, by Monday. So definitely ice on the move. It's certainly built back up, and we have ice there along the southwest coast, Kuskokwim, Bristol Bays, as well as redeveloping there across the northern half of Cook Inlet. And looking at the marine forecast on Thursday for the inner channels of the Panhandle, southeast winds 25 knots, Ketchikan, Dixon entrance, 8-foot waves. North winds, though, 20 to 25 knots. Petersburg on up through Lynn Canal, some gusts to 40 knots near Petersburg, waves 4 to 5 feet. The outer coast will see east-southeast gales 35 to 40 knots developing, especially south of Gustavus off of Sitka and Craig, with waves 17, 18 feet. On Friday, winds will be southeast through the lower half of the Panhandle, inner channels at 20 knots, a few gusts to 35 knots near Petersburg, waves 4 feet. North winds, Lynn Canal, 20 knots, 4-foot waves. Outer coast, 20 to 25 knot southeast to south winds, Craig up to west of Gustavus, and then look for southeast winds turning easterly 30 knots, Yakutat westward, waves generally running 13 to 16 feet there in the open waters of the Gulf. Stronger winds Thursday will be located off the Kenai coast, 40-45 knot easterly winds, waves 18 to 20 feet. Lower Cook Inlet 35 to 40 knot gales from the northeast with waves of 12 to 17 feet, and Prince William Sound northeast winds 15 knots, waves 3 feet. Winds will come down a bit for Friday, generally out over the northwestern Gulf, 20 to 25 knot east winds, waves around 12 feet. Still northeast winds 25 to knots or so out of the east-northeast lower half of Cook Inlet with waves of 8 to 9 feet. And then for Kodiak Island, look for northeast winds on Thursday to 45 knot gales through Shelikof Strait and east of Kodiak Island with waves running around 18-19 feet with low pressure located in vicinity as we go down the length of the Alaska Peninsula. We expect 30 knot winds in a counterclockwise fashion, 16-foot waves well off the southern coast there of the Panhandle, and 6 to 10 foot waves Bristol Bay to north of Cold Bay. For Friday, winds will be out of the northeast there, Bristol Bay, Shelikof Strait at 15 knots, waves 3 to 4 feet. Look for easterly winds to 20 knots as you go down the length of the Alaska Peninsula, waves 4 feet north of Cold Bay and generally around 10 to 12 feet south side of the Alaska Peninsula. On Thursday, southwest winds generally 15 to 20 knots, eastern Aleutians, turning northwesterly 25 to 30 knots, especially from Atka westward through Adak. And waves will generally be running 10 to 12 feet on the North Pacific side, 9 to 12 feet on the Bering side. For Friday, low pressure will be in the vicinity of the central Aleutians. Ahead of it, east to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, waves anywhere from around 7 to say 11 feet, and winds a little more variable there south of Atka, turning northerly west of Adak to 25 knots, and waves 8 to 10 feet on the Bering side. Plenty of ice along the southwest coast. Winds will be north to northeasterly as you get off of the YK deltas, and increase to 35 to 30 knot northeasterly winds from St. Matthew down to St. Paul, St. George. Waves in open water 9 to 13 feet. Friday, winds are northeast across much of the region, with the exception there east of St. Paul, 15 knot winds, 8-foot waves. But expect northeast winds south of St. Lawrence, and with waves as high as 11 feet in the vicinity of St. Matthew. Along the Arctic coast and northwest coast, east winds to 20 knots with ice in place. And then across the lower Chukchi Sea through the Bering Strait, look for northeast to north winds of 20 to 25 knots with ice there in place as well. And then finally, Friday, winds will be generally out of the east 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coast, turning northeast to north through the lower Chukchi Sea and accelerating to 30 knots through the Bering Strait with ice throughout the area.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.